Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, it is truly an honor to work with the veterans in Tennessee, and we have hundreds of thousands of veterans in our state. And I know that the chairman says he prides himself in working with the veterans. I will tell you quite frankly, I consider it a humbling experience to work with these veterans. And whether they're from World War II or Korea or Vietnam, whether they are from any of our recent wars, the Middle East, whether we're dealing with Agent Orange or burn pits, to me it is heart-wrenching to hear their stories. And the VA has not done their job. So what we're doing is standing up for these veterans and saying to the VA, get your act together, provide this information. How do you deal with this backlog? Do you have the capability to deal with what we're discussing? Do you have that capability? What is your capacity? How do we best handle these issues? Now, the VA for years, decades, has not done their job in a timely manner, in a responsive manner to our nation's veterans. So, therefore, let's get this right. Let's get it right. Excuse me, there's a fly in this chamber. Let's get it right now. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that my following statement appear in a separate place in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Last week's conversations about our own government's role in the COVID cover-up reflected over a year of refusal on the part of my Democratic colleagues to accept that the novel coronavirus may not have spread via natural transmission from a Chinese wildlife wet market. As the theories of the pandemic's origins evolved, one remained, until very recently, off limits. This is, of course, the lab leak hypothesis, or the theory that the virus somehow escaped a lab in Wuhan, China. Now, this theory didn't come out of nowhere. In early January 2020, alarm bells were already ringing at the CDC, the State Department, and in the scientific community over problems with the natural origin theory of transmission. Virologists and public health officials studying the disease were quickly coming to the conclusion that the way the virus was spreading suggested this theory was flawed. Officials also knew that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was conducting controversial and dangerous gain-of-function research with the help of repackaged U.S. government grants. Yes, that is correct. In April of last year, I joined many of my colleagues in publicly demanding a thorough investigation into the lab leak theory. What followed was nothing less than moral panic. Activists, journalists, and even our own Democratic colleagues accused us of racism, xenophobia, and science denial. Major media organizations refused to report on the hypothesis, except to decry it as a racist attack on Chinese scientists. Facebook banned accounts that posted about it. YouTube deleted videos that dared contradict the World Health Organization. Rather than scaring us off, though, these attacks left us with another question to answer. Why did the very idea of investigating the Wuhan lab inspire such a bizarre panic? Or perhaps the better question is, why did NIAID Director Dr. Fauci and the rest of the powers that be publicly insist that the idea of a lab leak was completely preposterous? Even NIH Director Francis Collins hadn't ruled it out. In a March 2020 interview with The Atlantic, he said that while natural transmission was the likely culprit, and I quote, "The possibility that such a naturally evolved virus might have also been under study at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and reached residents of Wuhan and ultimately the rest of the world as the result of a lab accident has never been adequately excluded," end quote. We certainly have evidence to show that mistakes happen, even in a professional lab. Who could forget that back in 2015, we saw reports that DoD personnel at a military facility in Utah accidentally shipped active samples of anthrax to labs in 9 states. Yes, a 2015 lab accident. NIH has also had problems keeping track of things. According to a memo prepared in 2016 by the majority staff of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, a 2009 Department of Health and Human Services OIG audit found an inventory discrepancy at the NIH caused in part by mislabeled envelopes containing unregistered vials of plague and other antibiotic-resistant bacteria. In 2012, NIH researchers found vials of anthrax spores in the wrong place. What's worse, the scientists in that particular lab weren't registered to possess them. In 2014, an FDA researcher working at the NIH campus in Bethesda discovered vials of live smallpox virus stuffed in a cardboard box in an unsecured cold storage room. Mistakes were clearly made. Lab accidents happen. It's also clear that while a leak from the Wuhan lab could have happened due to human error, this cover-up we're now learning about certainly did not happen by error. We now have an emerging picture of what did happen behind the scenes to create so much resistance to the lab leak theory. On June 3 of this year, that bastion of right-wing insanity known as Vanity Fair magazine published an investigative report exposing the deranged political gamesmanship that prompted public health officials to paint the lab leak theory as a conspiracy. The report confirmed just about everything those officials wanted to keep hidden, namely, that the lab leak hypothesis was suppressed at multiple levels of government by officials looking to protect their own interest and to distance themselves from President Donald Trump. So much for following the science. They were following emotions. The report confirmed conflicts of interest concerning grant awards that supported gain-of-function research at where? The Wuhan Institute of Virology. The same people who knew that Chinese scientists were performing these dangerous experiments on the taxpayer dime also knew from verified intelligence reports that 3 Wuhan-based researchers fell ill with COVID-like symptoms in November 2019, well before the first reported outbreak. Still, State Department officials warned investigators to abandon their inquiries into the origins of COVID-19 because it would, and I quote, open a can of worms, end quote. The internal cover-ups bled into this year until finally, 5 days before President Biden took the oath of office, the State Department put out a fact sheet on the Wuhan lab that confirmed the November outbreak and revealed that scientists working there had collaborated with the Chinese military on classified research. The Biden administration has yet to walk any of this back. We're also finally seeing some interest in the World Health Organization's Beijing-controlled investigation into the Wuhan lab. On March 1 of this year, and again on May 24th, I laid out my concerns to the White House about the WHO's reliance on the Chinese Communist Party for funding and support. I explained how this reliance drove their initial support for Beijing's response to the outbreaks and ruined the integrity of their investigation. The White House has yet to respond to my concerns, and they're not going to be able to avoid responding because the American people are demanding the answers. I think it's important to state for the record that what we're seeing in these news reports is not entirely new information. The foundations of the lab leak hypothesis remain much the same as they were a year ago. So, why pop open that can of worms right now? Because there's no way to sweep this thing back under the rug. We have the sudden interest of the media. Imagine that. We also have an entire body of published statements and investigative reporting from inside China. Facebook and YouTube have reversed their content policies, which means they couldn't stop people from sharing this information unless they pulled the plug on the entire internet, which obviously that isn't an option. We also have the magic of FOIA on our side. We learned from Dr. Fauci's published emails that he knew about the dangerous research happening in China. He was aware. We know he allowed inquiries into the Wuhan lab leak theory to go unanswered. We also know he worked with Mark Zuckerberg to determine what COVID-related information flowed into the public timeline and when that information went out. Now, I stand by my criticism of Dr. Fauci. His dystopian comments equating attacks on his job performance with attacks on science are unacceptable. But I want to encourage everyone to not make this about one person. We now have evidence that public officials were eating each other alive over political disagreements, and that these disagreements derailed investigations into the origins of COVID-19. This is more than just political failure. It is a moral inversion that empowered one of the globe's most violent authoritarian governments. The Chinese officials that hid the existence of the novel coronavirus from international bodies are the very same Chinese officials who gunned down freedom fighters in Hong Kong, who unleashed political violence in Inner Mongolia and Tibet, and who continue to commit ongoing genocide against the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. It's time for Congress to get serious about cleaning up this mess. I reiterate the same demands I made more than a year ago for a full and unbiased inquiry into the lab leak hypothesis and a broader investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. Last week, I joined Senator Cotton in reintroducing the Lee-Windley-Yang Global Public Health Accountability Act. This legislation would authorize the president to sanction foreign officials who suppress or distort information about international public health crises, including COVID-19. I encourage my colleagues to sign on to the bill. But most importantly, I would implore my Democratic colleagues to engage in a little introspection. The officials implicated in this cover-up swept science under the rug, orchestrated a relentless smear campaign, throttled the flow of public information, and allowed the Chinese Communist Party to exonerate itself at the expense of truth and accountability. You don't have to defend this. Please have the moral courage to make the right choice and join us in our demands for unbiased investigations into the origin of the pandemic. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the referenced articles, reports, and letters accompany my remarks in the congressional record.
Without objection.
I yield the floor.